Good afternoon. I am Marcia Ferranto, CEO of the National Law Enforcement Memorial Museum. Our museum opened its doors in 2018 with the express purpose of telling and honoring the story of American law enforcement. In fact, storytelling is what makes museums so magnificent. When artifacts combined with expert research and the curiosity of countless visitors come together, it provides an opportunity for enlightenment, education, and at times, a life-changing event. And through the stories we tell, we honor our own past, our daily lives, and our hopes for the future. Beginning on August 27th, the National Law Enforcement Museum is proud to tell the law enforcement story of 9/11 through our first ever major exhibition, Post-9/11, the evolution of American law enforcement. Curating an exhibit is a fascinating experience. The subject matter of 9/11 is an emotional one, especially as we approach the 20th anniversary of the attacks. There is so much content, so many stories to tell. How do we focus and on what? How do we decide what details to include? That is the nature of today's conversation, to pull back the curtain on the process of creating an exhibit and on the challenges and responsibilities of honoring the law enforcement story of 9/11. We're joined by a stellar panel, some of whom partnered with us to bring our exhibit to life, and others who are leading the museum field. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, whose generosity brought this exhibit to life. Many thanks to the Police Unity Tour, Goodyear, Bio1 Inc., Thomson Reuters, 511 Tactical, Adam R. Rose, and Peter R. McQuillan. We also need your support. Make a donation to the museum by texting Programs 2021 to 41444. This will allow us to continue our mission to honor the fallen, tell the story of American law enforcement, and make it safer for those who serve. To start us off, we are honored to welcome Laura Lott for keynote remarks. Laura is the president and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums, or AAM, representing the entire scope of the museum community. Prior to being CEO, Laura served as AAM's Chief Operating Officer. Laura led the 2012 relaunch of the Alliance, including rebranding the organization and redesigning its membership and excellence programs to be more inclusive, leading to 70% more membership. A passionate advocate for strong and engaged boards, Laura frequently speaks about nonprofit governance, organizational leadership, and strategy. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Marcia. And thanks to the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum for including me in this important program. It is a pleasure to speak to you today about the many and evolving roles of museums. For those not familiar with the American Alliance of Museums, we are the largest and most diverse community of museums and museum professionals in the world, over 35,000. We represent the broad scope of museums, from art museums to zoos and everything in between. From the largest national museum systems, such as the Smithsonian Institution, to the tiniest museums, many in rural communities all across the country. Before I talk about the power of exhibits and telling stories, I always like to begin with a few fun facts on the economic importance and popularity of museums. We don't often think about the museums in economic terms because they are in fact priceless. But U.S. museums are a $50 billion industry and support nearly 750,000 jobs across the country. Museums and other nonprofit cultural organizations return more than $5 in tax revenues for every $1 they receive in funding from all levels of government. And they're extremely popular. Every year in the United States, there are 850 million museum visits. That's 6.5 times the total attendance at all major league sporting events combined. Regardless of the size, location, or type of museum, each museum serves an important mission, a community or multiple communities, and AAM works to champion their vital role in our society. I often get asked about my favorite museum, but that's kind of like asking for your favorite child. You probably have one, but you can never admit it to anyone. The truth is, I really don't have a favorite single museum, but it's often the last one I visited. My favorite museums are those that most challenge and inspire me, those that really know and serve their communities, those that strive to engage new audiences, to educate children and people of all ages with unique experiences, and those museums with dedicated teams who work tirelessly to tell stories from different perspectives. The Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum is clearly one of those museums. Living and working in Washington, D.C. for more than 20 years now, I have watched the museum grow, and I greatly appreciate your work. I know how hard it is, and I congratulate you. The stories you tell are personal for me, like they are for so many. My favorite uncle in upstate New York was a police officer and a sheriff of a small town. He retired a number of years ago, but his stories never stopped. Some of them were funny, others were serious, and they generally each had a lesson. Stories and lessons that stick with me today. He recently passed, and I was touched that the owner of the small town florist I called to send flowers to the family took the time to tell me how much Officer Ed, as they called him, meant to the community. Her stories of him showed me a different side of Uncle Ed. Hers and Uncle Ed's stories told me a different side of law enforcement. At a time when we hear a lot of negative news about our law enforcement, these personal stories and positive experiences of those whose voices aren't being told are a crucial perspective. Stories have a way of opening our minds to learning more, to thinking differently. They stick with us and continue to influence our thinking long after they're told. At their core, that's what museums are about. Telling stories so we never forget. Telling stories from multiple perspectives to open our minds and deepen our understanding. Telling stories that often go untold in media and in schools. Telling stories that make us pause and be inspired by new thoughts, ideas, and ways of looking at the world. The thing that makes museums unique are their collections, the exhibits and experiences they provide. But museums are not dusty storehouses of objects. Without the stories, the collections are just things. Sure, we can enjoy them for their beauty or interesting features, or maybe, in this largely virtual world, just for their authenticity. There's so much power in the real things, the real places, the real experts. But it's the stories that really make our collections come alive. Museums are among the most trusted institutions in our country. Our public opinion polling shows that the only thing more trusted than museums are friends and family. Museums are trusted more than researchers and scientists, than other nonprofits, more than local and national news, the US government, corporations and businesses, etc. The most frequently cited reasons for the public's trust were that museums are fact-based, that they often present real, authentic objects and primary sources, and they're research-oriented. The public also appreciates that museums allow people to draw their own conclusions. They feel museums offer objective information. While no museum exhibit can do everything or tell every side of a story, the best exhibits help us grapple with our history, give context to current events and debates, offer different perspectives that challenge our assumptions and build empathy for others. The best exhibits open our eyes to a deeper understanding and appreciation. The best exhibits are a spark to let our imaginations run wild about what the future holds. The best museums and their exhibits inspire us about the human spirit, our ability to endure, to overcome great struggles, and to achieve great things. In this rapidly changing world, when we're more connected than ever, it's hard not to feel like our country has ever been more divided. That there's a declining empathy for fellow humans who have different beliefs, experiences, and traditions than our own. Sadly, it's now easier than ever to isolate ourselves and avoid learning different perspectives. Museums have a role in helping us do better as a society. They're essential to addressing many of the world's struggles. I've thought a lot about this in the past year and a half as the global pandemic of COVID-19 and our divisive national politics and racial reckoning have raised new struggles and illuminated old ones. During this time especially, I have really missed our museums. Many are working hard to collect and interpret this moment, even while it's still happening. One museum says it this way: Museums are no longer static. We don't just hold objects, we hold them up. We tell the stories behind them, the stories that connect us to our past and inspire a vision for our future. Even more than that, I think museums stand as pillars in our communities and as convening spaces that encourage reflection and conversation, nourishing our minds, our spirits, and our relationships with each other. In this chaotic 24/7 news cycle, when we're encouraged to quickly pick a side on every issue, museums can offer a respite, an opportunity to slow down, to reflect, to process, to imagine. The events of 9/11 are often explained as a failure of imagination. The memories are still painful for those of us who lived through it, still struggling to understand and cope with our feelings. And for my 8-year-old daughter, 9/11 is in the history books. One day, museums will help her understand the significance, the lessons, and the personal struggles and triumphs. On this 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, museums play a critical role in helping us remember, better understand, and build a better future. Museums do change the world. On behalf of the American Alliance of Museums, I salute you, the museum staff and leadership, and all who support our museums. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And now, our moderator for today's discussion, Thomas Canavan. Thomas is the executive director of the National Law Enforcement Museum. Thomas joined the museum in late 2019 and has since refocused the museum into what it is today, a place to come to honor law enforcement. Thomas leads the museum's operations, which includes education, outreach, and fostering strategic partnerships, all of which focuses on connecting law enforcement with the communities they serve. It is under Thomas's leadership and vision that post 9/11, the evolution of law enforcement was created.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Good afternoon, everyone. We're here to tell you about the National Law Enforcement Museum's first major exhibition, and it's one that focuses on a pivotal event in our nation's history and its ongoing impact on the law enforcement community. Our exhibition, Post 9/11, the Evolution of American Law Enforcement, provides us the opportunity to reflect on the story of 9/11, the heroes who lost their lives, and the process of creating the exhibition itself. For all of the museum leaders out there, you'll agree that this is a decisive moment for our institution. For this reason, and to introduce to all of you the people behind the curtain, we've brought together some colleagues from the museum field, including some of the team who helped bring to life this exhibition. Together, we'll discuss the impact of 9/11 and the creation of this 20th anniversary exhibition, as well as answer questions around why our exhibition and others dedicated to American storytelling are told in the way they are. So let me now introduce today's panelists. With us, we have David Schanzer, Director of the Triangle Center of Terrorism and Homeland Security for Duke University, Michael Burns, Chief of Experience Strategies for Quatrefoil Associates, Josh Feinberg, Museum Content Developer for JAF Consulting, Amy Weinstein, Senior Curator of Oral History and Vice President of Collections at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, and Cedric Ye, Curator of the National September 11th Collection at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. Thank you all again for being here today. Let's start by laying some groundwork. Creating a new exhibition starts somewhere. Josh, would you bring us into your process, and was there anything different when it came to creating post 9/11?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Thomas, for inviting me to be part of this panel. It was a great privilege to work on this exhibition with you. I think any exhibition, to a large degree, the process is similar to producing any kind of media. Whether it's a book or it's a film. Often it starts with an idea and an audience, right? So we know who the audience is, the museum audience, and then the idea is what we're trying to get across. Later on, we figure out what medium to use and how to integrate design and all of that. But it starts with the idea. And so in this case, the idea was twofold. One was to honor and memorialize those law enforcement officers who perished on 9/11 or as a result of 9/11. And then the other piece was to explore how law enforcement has changed over the 20 years since 9/11 and because of 9/11. So right away, it kind of presented a challenge, which was we're trying to do two things. We're trying to memorialize, but we're also trying to teach. And so that was, one challenge, or at least one unique aspect of this project, where we had to try to figure out how we can do both without them interfering with each other, and how they can sort of help each other. Another challenge was it's not really an exhibit about 9/11. It's an exhibit about law enforcement. In fact, it's called Post-9/11. So the question was, how do we deal with 9/11 in a way that feels like we're doing it justice, but yet then be able to pivot and really talk about other issues? 9/11 is almost like a kind of a content black hole. It just sucks everything else into it because it's so pivotal. And so the question was, how do we keep 9/11 in the story without it overtaking the story?
Thank you. Cedric, in your experience when you're creating exhibitions at the Smithsonian, what are a few key questions that you have in mind?
My apologies. Not unlike how Josh just described, we do look at the audience, what the narrative might be, what the collections might be. We try to keep in mind the broad narrative, the broad mandate that we're the nation's history museum, and what kind of stories we'll be telling. Do we tell one that's generic, or focus in on specific details? In the case of 9/11, one of the questions might be, for this upcoming 20th anniversary, do we continue to commemorate, to explain, to talk about the events, or do we switch to a more detailed look at perhaps some of the lesser known aspects of the attacks and the repercussions? Perhaps if we were looking at some stage early on or throughout the exhibit experience, the building process, we'd also probably want to involve internal and external advisors, partners, community groups, scholars, to ensure that we have or are aware of point of views, different point of views, different inputs. In the end, choose which path that we're going to go down.
Excellent. Good. Yeah, it certainly takes a village, and that's something that we've learned throughout this process, is that we've been able to bring a lot of really great people to the table in order to produce this. And Cedric and also Amy, we're going to ask a little bit later in the program a little bit more about what your institutions are doing specifically for the 20th anniversary. So hold those thoughts. Hey, Michael, over the years, as museum audiences grow, age, evolve, I wanted to ask you, what you thought of that, museum audiences are looking for these days, specifically within exhibitions.
Yeah, so, well, the first thing that's really important is that they can't do this at home, right? Like there's a reason for them to come to the museum. I think, though, that one of the things that has changed over the years is the expectation of participation. People feel like they want to be more involved. And I think this probably has a lot to do with the environment we live in. It used to be that you would get a newspaper or you would turn on the TV and there were several channels to pick from, and everybody was getting their information from certain sources. Now, not only are there massive amounts of sources to get information from, but there's also the ability for you to have a say. And so that idea of participation in our social environment carries over into museum exhibitions. Technology also, like how do people find entertainment? Where do they find entertainment? What are they doing, to entertain themselves? Bringing those sorts of tools into the museum experience can allow for the visitor to feel more a part of the story and more engaged. It's no longer a passive experience where you just sort of walk through and look at things. There are still plenty of those kinds of exhibitions, but that's not really, I don't think, what in a big way, that's not necessarily what audiences are necessarily looking for.
I think it's probably interesting for Josh as a content writer, and you, Michael, thinking about the experiences of how to balance, what audiences are looking for today, and then also traditional kind of methods of communication, within exhibition experiences. Josh, do you think that our exhibition captures, both of those things?
I think so. I think obviously people are looking for technology and they're looking for interaction. But also, Michael pointed out that part of what you want in a museum is something you can't do at home. You want something that's authentic. You want something that is unique, that is special, and that's why so many people go see, the Mona Lisa or other famous objects, because you can't have the same experience at home. And I think in this exhibition we tried to incorporate artifacts and objects as well as media and technology. And I think especially around 9/11, it was important that we had some material objects from the event itself, because it really connects you in a personal way, in a way that media connect you in a different way. But to be able to stand in the presence of a beam from the World Trade Center, or a jacket that was worn by a police officer at Ground Zero, connects you in a different way that you can't replicate anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've all probably at times been frustrated when exhibits don't touch on parts of the story that we're particularly interested in, or when we go to an exhibition hoping to see certain artifacts that aren't on display. And our museum, for example, has a collection of more than 20,000 objects, and only about 800 or so are on display at any one time. And so my first part of the question is for Cedric. How does your museum build a collection around a specific event or time period?
Well, luckily for us, anyways, the Smithsonian has over 150 years of collecting behind it. And if we don't happen to have the collections or the depth of collections to tell a specific story, we follow a fairly traditional pathway of research and outreach to identify collections that can either bolster or start collections for the story that we wish to tell, and a lot of footwork and knocking on doors. But in the terms of 9/11 and how we arrived there, the original collecting curators were faced with a very difficult task. They were on the ground within about a month, and the idea here was, how exactly to tell the story. Congress had mandated that we preserve what happened on that day. Which parts of the story? How will you be able to capture this moment when you yourself just went through it? They chose to start with the collecting plan, one that focused in on the attacks, first responders, and the rescue effort. The way I usually try to describe it is like a net. It told the story of what happened on that day, plus perhaps a month. It covered it, but there were a lot of holes left to be filled in.
Cedric, let me back up real quick. Who creates the collection plan? Where does that happen in the process?
In this case, it was a select group of curators who were known for their ability with collecting and identifying objects that told the appropriate stories, and they decided that how they would address this problem, how they would try and tell a story and preserve what happened, at least as best they could, without being overwhelmed, without in some way feeling like they had left something off the narrative. But then the process basically ended with everything from keeping an eye on media closely, everything from newspapers, nightly newscasts, identifying stories while they were on the ground, going after the potential collections, but given the sensitivity of time, being aware of pain and the trauma that was going on, that more often than not used intermediaries, people that were trusted by potential donors, so that it wouldn't come across as not being respectful. But these are just some of the ways, it is specifically for how we gather together our 9/11 collections.
And the Smithsonian does this for major events, typically.
It happens. I mean, in the interim, we sent curators, say, for instance, to natural disasters. There was Katrina, some of the mass shootings, and just recently, January 6th, we had curators on the ground at the Capitol. So, you know, it depends. I can't speak to those. Some of those were, this isn't how we normally do the collecting, but sometimes we recognize that this is what is expected of us. As I mentioned, you know, being the Nation's History Museum, that you might have to step outside the box and think how best to capture the moment and preserve what happened.
That's fascinating. I think that's something that not many people know, that museums are engaged that quickly following an event. So thank you for that. And Amy, I'm sure you all face the same challenge, you know, being limited with space. And, you know, how do you all go about deciding, you know, what parts of your collections are shared with the public?
Thank you, Thomas. And can I just go back and comment on something that Cedric said, and also
Absolutely.
answer your question, if that's okay?
Sure.
I was part of the primary collecting around 9/11 back in 2001 and 2002. The 9/11 Museum, of course, didn't exist. We didn't come into being for several years, but there were history curators, public historians, oral historians at museums throughout New York and at the Smithsonian and in Pennsylvania near Shanksville, who saw a need. And I'm so impressed that Cedric and the Smithsonian had a collecting plan. I can't say that we had a collecting plan, but we did have a catch net. We did have that fishing net, and did the best that we could to anticipate what might history expect of museums down the road. I was part of a consortium of museums. We tried to help each other out. This was totally new territory for all of us. We would see each other at the Fresh Kills landfill, at Ground Zero, at St. Paul's Chapel, and we also helped out other smaller institutions who did not have curators that they could send. So we kept our eyes and ears open. So the organization that I worked with then, the New York Historical Society, as well as the New York State Museum, the New Jersey State Museum, and some other institutions, had collections that could be made accessible and available to the new museum. But we continued at the 9/11 Museum, we continued to collect objects and oral histories. And the passage of time, even the 5 years that passed before I joined the museum, I think made it possible for us to do things such as more comfortably approach 9/11 family members. That was something, and I think Cedric would agree with this, that we told ourselves, we made a rule that it was not something we were going to do. We were not going to intrude on 9/11 family members' grief. I feel like with the passage of 5 years and the creation of a dedicated institution, we put our toe in that water and are still doing that. So because of that, because the collecting has been happening for 20 years, you are absolutely right. Only a small percentage of our collections is on view at any one time. But we try to, in the memorial exhibition, in memoriam, for instance, change that exhibition once every year. The pandemic wreaked a little havoc with that schedule. Hopefully we'll get back to it and look at who died, either from a geographic perspective, thematic, hobbies, sports. We try to be as inclusive as we can, include the demographics of the victim population and the sites in doing that. And then, of course, we borrow from other museums. You've borrowed from us for this exhibition, but we borrow from the Smithsonian, the 9/11 Museum, and from survivors and family members. So we have some measure of rotation of objects, but there is so much more. You'd have to go to our website and check out our collections features there.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to bring in our guest curator for Post 9/11, David Schanzer. David, with our upcoming exhibition, we're 20 years after the attacks of 9/11, and I just wanted to ask, how have you seen perceptions of the attacks change over the course of the last 2 decades?
Well, thank you, Thomas. It was a real honor to be part of this whole project. I think I'm the only one on this call who's never been involved with creating an exhibit, so it was an education for me. It's interesting. I think, first of all, I teach at a university, and when I first started teaching in 2005, all of my students had, personally experienced 9/11. And now here we sit coming into the fall of 2021, and the students either hadn't been born or were in diapers at that time. So more and more of the population has not known and felt what it was like to be here on that day. And so that's why I think it's really important the way we put the first part of the exhibit together. It's a small area, smallish area compared to the entirety of the space, but it's enough to kind of either bring people back to that moment or to have them feel what all of us who were there, who did experience it, were feeling on that day. Because I think you can't really understand the post 9/11 period unless you understand the trauma and the fear that the event created. And I do think sometimes when we're looking back on it, we forget, why weren't we more rational? How could we have done X, Y, or Z? Well, it was because the event was so unique and so traumatic, and people were afraid. I remember being afraid myself, being a resident of Washington, D.C., and having experienced the anthrax attack on the Capitol a month after 9/11, to have heard choppers and military aircraft patrolling the city on the night before, and worrying about all kinds of things that you didn't have to worry about. We have a representative of the Smithsonian. I had 3 children who were going to daycare at the Smithsonian at the time. And after 9/11, we had to start at each museum where I dropped them off at daycare, having to have our car checked in the trunk and people looking in mirrors underneath. So I think, since it's so hard to recapture that, I think that, our perceptions are evolving and changing. And I think that's great that the exhibit tries to bring us back there and then talks about the changes that were made.
Yeah, and that leads me into our next question. So when it comes to 9/11, many of us remember those attacks personally, but for younger audience, they might not have that personal connection. Michael, in a museum setting, what's different about your approach working with a recent subject versus one that happened, long before a visitor was around to know about it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we talked about that in developing this exhibition, especially when it came to the beginning of the exhibition and the opening into 9/11. It all comes down to storytelling ultimately, and then how you engage people in a story. And you know, we can watch a film on World War One. None of us having been in World War One, but we can be brought to tears because of the way that the story is told. So emotionally, we can connect to things even when we haven't experienced them directly. And then when we have experienced something, you know, we've experienced it in different ways. So people that were kind of around in 9/11, I remember I was in Chicago and I'd just shown up to work. And I've talked to other people too who've shared, you know, how surprising it was that it was like a perfect day. It was like blue skies. It was beautiful. It seemed seemingly all over the country for some reason. It just was perfect weather. And people, and so this is a subtle kind of, you know, detail that people that experienced it kind of know. It's kind of an inside understanding of something. Folks who didn't experience it maybe know it through classes or know it through documentaries or know it through friends or family members that told them about it or know it through exhibitions. But it's through storytelling that they know it. The thing that we need to do when we create exhibitions like this is have a general understanding of how familiar it's going to be. And because this is such a prominent thing in our recent history, we felt that, and Josh will be able to speak to this maybe better, but we felt that it was known enough so that we can sort of present 9/11 in the way that David had mentioned, which is to kind of create an experience in the beginning that it really is based more on emotion than information, to get people to understand how we all felt. And when it comes to creating exhibitions, like how you tell the story, like how much you need to say or not say, how much orientation there needs to be, really depends on how familiar the audience will be. Then there's the engagement aspect. You know, I mentioned before that it's kind of important that people feel like we know that if you're going to learn something, you can retain information better if you have a chance to actually get into it a little bit more than being told about it. So engagement is really important in getting people to understand things and getting them to feel more connected to things. And how you engage people who were there may be different than how you engage people who weren't. So we could all be asked, you know, what were you doing? Where were you when you know this happened? You know, and talk about things from that point of view. With folks that weren't there, a different kind of engagement may be necessary, but one that still can involve their sense of what took place, but it's going to be more intellectualized rather than emotional in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting if you're, you know, if you're reading something within the exhibition that it was a bright sunny day, you might wonder why that detail was included. And we might not be thinking about an audience who wasn't there, right? Who needs that context. Yeah. So I think it's really important in this process to think about this audience specifically. And I wanted to stay here for just another question for you, Josh. So we have a generation now that wasn't around during 9/11 and who have been very engaged, you know, with various law enforcement issues over the last few years. We've seen a lot more of that engagement, which is great. And so I just wanted to, you know, hear if you had any specific you know, moments where you were creating the exhibition and you were kind of thinking of this, you know, new audience and how they were going to be receiving this exhibition specifically.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, you know, obviously issues around law enforcement are in the public debate, and there's a lot of discussion about law enforcement these days. And while we weren't addressing those issues directly in the exhibition, there are certain resonances to certain places where it connects with contemporary issues. And without wading into the debate, we really just wanted to, wherever possible, kind of provide some context and provide some, it's not ancient history, but as you point out, for young people, it is history. You know, and so when you think about certain issues, say privacy, you know, and surveillance, that kind of stuff, we felt that it was important to talk about the historical context in the context of 9/11, how those issues have developed, over the past 20 years to get to where we are today. So we talk about in the exhibition, we talk about the Patriot Act, and as a one response to 9/11 that gave law enforcement certain powers to investigate and to prevent terror, and that is part of the discussion about personal privacy and that kind of thing. And it didn't start the conversation, but it was part of the ongoing debate. And so I think it's important, through exhibitions and other media to really provide historical context for the issues that are going on today. And then people can go on and have those conversations and have those debates. But the more context, the better.
So thank you very much. And just for the sake of our audience, I want to just take a second to talk a little bit about the relationship of the team here that we have. Amy and Cedric are our guests from the museum field, but Michael, David, and Josh have been working, I think, since last December, probably last November, maybe, when we kicked off the planning for the exhibition. So Josh, I would just stick with you. Could you talk a little bit about your role as the content developer and how you and David and Michael work together throughout this process?
Sure. My role is kind of to be, in a lot of ways, a stand-in for visitors, because I don't know anything. I'm not an expert. Okay, I know some things, but I'm not the content expert. So I'm seeing the content the way a visitor is seeing it. I'm asking the questions that a visitor is asking. I am thinking about what the visitor wants to know and who the audience is and what the best way to give that information across is. So that's really my role, is to figure out how we're communicating the content. I work with Michael, who is a designer, who is thinking about the physical space, who's thinking about, he can talk about what he does, but he's a designer. He's thinking about the physicality of it. And David is the content expert who has the wealth of knowledge and the context for all of the information. So my role is to kind of work with both of them to figure out how we bring the content together with the physical, to actually, create a narrative that is going to engage visitors.
Yeah, it's a fascinating structure, and I think it's something that within a aspect of our audience that's not as knowledgeable of the museum field, to learn about how exhibitions get created, I think is very interesting. Anyways, so thanks for that, shedding a little light. David or Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that one of the things that should be pointed out too is that we have a pretty good team behind us. We've got, I play a certain role. Josh plays a significant role in the content, and as he described, making sure that it's kind of something that is understandable for a general audience. Rulitza Palace, who's the lead designer on the project, is amazing, and she really did a lot of the heavy lifting, along with Jill Hess and Cole Breeding. Cole's our graphic designer. Bernard Mueller, who's the project manager, and John Lee, who's our tech guy. So there's so many people involved in all these different aspects. It's kind of like when you go behind the scenes of a museum. Visitors go behind the scenes and are like, wow, it takes all this to put some displays on the floor. Mm-hmm. But it's so much more complicated because we're really trying to get it right. And so we have a lot of expertise involved in creating this.
Absolutely. Talking about subject matter and 9/11, Amy, you and your institution have obviously an extremely unique perspective when it comes to telling the story of 9/11. What are some roadblocks or surprises that you've seen along the way in talking about 9/11? Are there aspects of the story that are still too challenging to discuss, specifically within a museum setting?
I'd like to go back to what was challenging on September 11th and September 12th, 2001, because I think that remains challenging for us, for the world. I shouldn't say for us, or maybe for the United States. The newspaper editors, the night of the 11th and overnight, faced the horrible choice, a decision, what to do about photographs that were taken of the people who either fell, stepped off the ledge, had that choiceless choice to make. Some people thought it was too important not to document in their newspapers. Others thought it was a horrible thing that should never have been published. So along the way, in the 20 years since then, I've had the amazing ability to talk to so many responders, so many witnesses on the street, and so many family members. There are responders in law enforcement and other witnesses who said they felt an obligation to watch those last moments. There are others who said they felt an obligation to close their eyes or turn their back. There were cops who said to me that they were sending thought waves to the people up there. Wait, we'll get there. You know, that they did everything in their power, but they couldn't do what they were trained to do. So I would say it was a struggle for us in the museum to think about how to present that topic. And I think it remains difficult today to think about it, but and I was surprised how different family members felt differently. Some felt it happened, it's historic, you must show it, and others thought, no, we shouldn't. So we made decisions to be very careful about how we did it. But as an oral historian, I've heard so many people talk about what it felt like to be there, to be a witness to that circumstance, that happening. So I think that's the one of the most challenging topics we've faced.
Absolutely, very an emotional challenge, definitely. David, what about within the academic fields? Are there topics within 9/11 that people are thinking about now that might have been different than in the past?
Well, I can't really speak for all academics. Your question, which you posed earlier, has just made me think about what are the stories about 9/11 or the issues that are least explored or least understood 20 years later. And came up with a couple of thoughts, and having Amy here has also made me think of another thing. But there were 7.5 years in between the first bombing of the World Trade Center and 9/11. And the problem is that a lot of the things that were revealed, the safety defects, the lack of operability of the radios for first responders, I think we lost 7.5 years and didn't do enough to deal with the security and the response capabilities in that building and among the fire department and the NYPD and so on. So there were some serious failures there, and I don't think we've really explored that maybe as deeply as we might have. Another thought is that comes to mind, having worked on this exhibit and listened to some of your advisory committee from the law enforcement community, and really who kept bringing us back over and over again to the people who have died since 9/11, not at 9/11, but because of the exposure to the toxic materials. And quite frankly, when you look back on it, and I think about the days afterwards, those people should not have been there. And there was a real effort to try to create this sense of normalcy I think a lot of people, a lot of officials failed to protect people from the toxicity that was in that site. And frankly, of course, trying to save victims is a top priority, but I'm not aware of any victims that were identified more than, within hours of the attack. Amy can correct me if I'm wrong. So that said, the project of clearing the rubble and finding remains could have waited until we tested and cleared the site and until it became safe and we had protective equipment for people. And I don't think that's a story that's really been told at all. And we've lost more police officers, I believe, from the exposures than we did on 9/11 itself. And the final thing that comes to mind, if you haven't visited the 9/11 Memorial Museum, it's really, you have to go there to experience it. That's one place you cannot experience just by looking at the catalog online. And I think the fact that museums that are where something happened are really the most powerful. And I think one of the biggest stories about 9/11 is what didn't happen. And it's represented by that giant wall that is part of the museum that's essentially keeping the Hudson River out of lower Manhattan. And it's a brooding presence throughout your entire trip to the museum. And, I'd just like to know personally more about how much stress was on it and how close we came to a much graver disaster than even 9/11. And that wall and the fact that it's part of the museum is a testament to whomever built it was pretty darn smart. I just think that's a really interesting story.
Can I try to answer some of the
Yeah,
questions
please.
a little bit, if that's okay? So thank you. There are two important walls in the museum. The slurry wall is the one you're speaking of. And on the morning of 9/11, there were people who immediately began to worry, be concerned about that wall, about the possibility of a breach. Among those who were worried were people who built that wall. And I shouldn't use the word worried, but we're thinking about it. So Arturo Ressi, who as a young man came from Italy to help build the slurry wall, who died a few years ago, was one of them. The Structural Engineers Association of New York, or members of the Structural Engineers community were concerned. But Daniel Libeskind, who won the competition for the master plan to redesign the whole site, when he went to Ground Zero several years later and saw that wall still standing, that struck him as a powerful symbol of resilience. Part of me wants to say resistance also, because it's resisting the flood of the water, and it's resisting manipulation of the story also. But let me not go down that direction. But the wall, and who else was so concerned about the wall? The construction workers on the site, the operating engineers, the laborers. Nobody knew, was the debris holding up that wall and keeping the Hudson back? So they very carefully removed that debris according to plan. The concern, I'm speaking in circles here, I'm sorry. The concern was, if the slurry wall breached, the waters from the Hudson would not only flood the World Trade Center site, it would flood the PATH train tubes, the subway stations, and cause who knows how many more deaths to the responders, deaths to perhaps the survivors who were waiting to be rescued, and to all parts of lower Manhattan through possibly through Midtown, where the PATH train ends at 33rd Street. So it's such a big topic. We received some funding to do a small a movie about the wall. It is preserved under federal and state law. It is an architectural relic, I guess, with with preservation, and it's part of our collection. So I'm so glad you brought it up. I could talk forever. I could tell you how they built it, but you don't want me to do that.
Well, Amy, let's stay with you for a second. Could you tell us a little bit about what you all are doing this year, different from the 10th anniversary?
Well, the 10th anniversary was when the memorial itself opened. The museum was not yet opened, but the Memorial Plaza opened for the 10th anniversary. And it's hard to describe that level of emotion to see so many family members coming to the memorial pretty much for the first time, survivors, others who hadn't been back since 2001 or 2002. So the pandemic really made it challenging for us. And so we're doing things a little bit differently. One thing we're doing is we're asking buildings throughout the city, and maybe it's also true in the Washington area or elsewhere in the country, if they've got the lights on the exterior, the way the Empire State Building and One World Trade have, to shine blue light on the night of the 11th. That is to complement the Tribute in Light, which was one of the first memorials that was shown in March, shined in March or February, whichever, March 2002, to remember those who were killed, to remind us that 6 months had passed. We are all thinking, some of it you don't see. So what you won't see is how deeply the staff is thinking about the issue of the dust and the toxic nature of the dust, and the thousands of law enforcement and firefighters, but also students and residents who have died of the toxic effects. That topic will have to wait for a few years before we can address it. So we are just so happy that the restrictions have been lifted in New York, that by the time when we open to family members only on September 11th, they'll be able to experience the museum fully and properly without the COVID-19 restrictions. We're also very happy to be working with museums like you, the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky, people who've asked to borrow, museums that have asked to borrow objects so we can get the collection out that way. And some TV and magazine coverage. So I think that this year will be a bit of a hybrid, the way we're all living in hybrid times, half virtual, half in person. So we'll be sharing the story in many different ways.
I think that's wonderful to have the opportunity to focus on those families on September 11th. So I'm sure that'll be a wonderful moment for them. Cedric, what about the Smithsonian and the American History Museum? What are you all doing this year?
Well, so I mentioned earlier that we'd had a fairly effective initial collecting process, and in the anniversary since then, we focused mostly on the commemoration timeline approach. We did take slightly different views towards the collection and how we presented it to the public, both for second anniversary show and then the 10th anniversary show. But as we approached the 20th anniversary, we began to, I think the first thought is this: the time. The idea is that in those early years, it could be described as too soon. We didn't have enough information. As I mentioned earlier, there was just so much to comprehend and be able to properly display. Not how we normally approach putting together exhibitions or researching collections. But at the 20th anniversary, I think that there was a genuine thought that we could shift the approach and perhaps apply some of how we would more traditionally put together an exhibition, where we have a much more in-depth understanding, or perhaps an in-depth look at a particular subject matter. I think that what we arrived at as I mentioned, through a lot of internal and external conversations, is that some of the things that have been just mentioned here, that, say, for instance, the last year and a half has shown a very different country. Different conversations have arisen, and the museum wanted to ensure that we were including all the voices, different voices. We're have a new interpretive plan, how we approach our publics, how we tell our stories. Yes, we're experts. We've been doing this for a long time, but have we included all of the communities? I think the way I look at it is this, that often it was said that 9/11 happened to all of us. Yes, that's true, but it wasn't monolithic. Not all the communities that 9/11 affected were affected the same. Some had very different experiences. And that community could be a borough in New York, could be a neighborhood, or it could be a community of law enforcement officers. You know, like what exactly was your experience? How exactly can we tell this? And we realized we couldn't do it just by saying this seems like a good idea. We started a 5-year, this 20th anniversary begins a 5-year project that the 20th kickstarts, where we begin to take a look at some of the finer details about the repercussions of September 11th, life, the health, healthcare crisis, how it affected. So perhaps a better example is that parallel to this process, I also began a new collecting initiative in New York City focusing in on the Latino communities, because we plan on focusing in on all the communities, but for the time being, at the time, that's where I got my funding. But the idea here is that at the time of the attacks, there was almost 30% of the population in New York City was Latino. And if I might say, it's kind of difficult to think of New York City without including the Latino communities there. And they were disproportionately affected by the attacks, if not the actual attacks, but the ramifications, what happened afterwards. And we wanted to provide an opportunity to give them a voice in this. What was their experience like? And in that process, I say we started, perhaps it influenced the development of the 20th, in that we also wanted to broaden the scope just a little bit and talk about all the different types of communities, the underrepresented stories, perhaps stories that, as has been brought up here, haven't necessarily been talked about, and how we might actually be able to present this in a more traditional Smithsonian manner. The trick here is it's very complicated. It isn't just that 20 years have passed. It isn't just that 9/11 still has such a deep emotional impact on all of us, but all of it together. We're starting the process, and we're hoping, I think, to be able to get the message out that we want to work with you. We're going to be more collaborative. We're going to hear your stories. We're going to present a point of view that isn't necessarily ours. We'll work with you. And maybe the best way we feel that we can do this is that we've started story gathering initiative. I know many of those exist, but we feel like we've created a digital implement on our website. Oh, and as an aside, yes, the pandemic was crippling, maybe the bad choice of word. Our ability to be able to plan out something that we would be more comfortable with was completely put on hold. Our 20th anniversary will be all digital, and we're doing the best we can following some of these mandates. But in this case, creating a digital tool that will allow our visitors to talk about what 9/11 means to them, and open it up broadly beyond, say, our usual foot traffic. Start working with communities across the country who perhaps may not think of us as a place that speaks to their story, to their narrative, and to build those relationships so that in 100 years, their stories, the ones that they feel like was their experience for 9/11, and not one that that may not have been told up until now, and it's a process. We're working on this. The pandemic has not helped, and that's a lot. So
no, that's great.
About that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think what you illustrate is the challenge of creating exhibitions and experiences for people who have a lot of different emotional connections to an event, and that leads right into our next question about how do you balance wanting to educate an audience on a subject that is very emotional for others who have a different connection to it. So, Josh, would you tell us a little bit about how you balance that within post 9/11?
Sure. I think a lot of it comes back to what I was talking about at the beginning about kind of having a clear goal for what the exhibition really is, and we really wanted to educate about law enforcement post 9/11, and we really wanted to remember the officers who've died as a result of 9/11. But our goal was not to have an encyclopedic exhibition about 9/11 itself. So I felt that gave us some freedom to tell the story without getting into into every crevice and every corner of the details. So I'll give you an example. David pointed out that at the beginning of the exhibition, we sort of put people in this kind of 9/11 moment where they can kind of revisit or visit for the first time the events of the day. And originally, at one point in the process, we had a whole timeline of events that happened that day that was going to be printed out on these banners. And it just seemed like, that's not what we need here. What we need here is not to overload it with content. What we need here is, and I think Michael mentioned this before, in that part, what we really needed was emotion. We really needed to give people the feeling, the sense. And so a lot of the content of the exhibition really is not in that section about 9/11. There's another section that's specifically a memorial to the officers who have died. There's not a lot of content in that part of the exhibition either. It's, again, much more about memory and experience. And so most of the content is really focused on the post 9/11 period. So, I think in thinking about the exhibition experience, we were really thinking about these three spaces and really thinking about the experience we wanted the visitor to have throughout, so that they would have a kind of a visceral emotional response to the 9/11 section. They'd have a chance to dig in deep and have a more intellectual experience in the post 9/11 section, and then they'd have a time for reflection in the memorial section. And so it was kind of partly about figuring out what we wanted the experience to be, and then how do we modulate that throughout the exhibition.
Yeah, excellent. Definitely a challenge, and you all did an excellent job, and I'm excited to open the doors on August 27th for everybody to come and see our work. So this has been a great conversation, and time has just flown by, as it always does. And so I wanted to leave a little bit of time for us just to get some final thoughts as we close. And if you have any thoughts around what you hope our audience who comes to the museum and experiences the exhibition, what they might take away with themselves. Amy, we'll start with you.
Okay, so thank you. I will share one of my research interests with you that I think overlaps with your exhibition, and that I hope that your visitors will find meaningful. And that is the the female first responders, the female police officers who responded and who were killed, the female firefighters. I know that's not your subject, and the female EMTs. But limiting myself just to the officers, I hope that that people will know about Moira Smith, will know about Captain Kathy Mazza. And sorry, I know I said it was the female responders, but I can't help but also throw in Ramon Suarez. Your visitors will see the cell phone that he used to call his wife that morning, as he did every morning. He called home on September 11th. His cell phone was found in the wreckage at Ground Zero. Kathy Mazza was an amazing leader. We know about what kind of leader she was in many ways, but from one other female officer who followed her into battle that morning, who was under her command. Sharon Miller survived. Nobody else on Captain Mazza's team did. That's another whole story. So that's one thing that I hope that your visitors will find themselves in the story, whether the visitor is a young Asian American boy, an older Black woman, whatever the demographic is. I'm sure your demographics, your visitors are as diverse as the country. And so I hope that they will all see themselves in your exhibition through the responders and the people who died and the survivors who from whom we've learned about their actions on 9/11.
Thank you. Cedric?
Well, it was an honor to be here and to hear about your process. Unfortunately, we weren't able to work together alone with us, but perhaps in the future. I'm certainly looking forward to visiting myself. Luckily, I'm in the neighborhood, and being able to see the finished product is something that we're also interested in. But as I've said, it's just such a big topic, and we have to pick and choose. So I'm very much interested to see your approach. I've heard so much about it today. And if there's any way that I might be able to assist in the future, we're going to be working on this for some time. I'll be happy to do what I can. And I look forward to being able to visit when things are not just for the exhibit, but just the whole city is more open and people feel like comfortable in being able to visit. Because I'd also like to visit the exhibit when there are people, just to experience that also and see their reactions.
Absolutely, that is one of the things I'm looking forward to as well. But let's go over to Josh for final thoughts.
Thank you again for this. And before I give a final thought, I also want to thank Michael for mentioning some of the many other people who worked on the exhibition. I don't want to suggest that it was just the three of us by any means. And that also goes to the museum itself and Thomas and your staff who were wonderful to work with and put in so much time and effort into this exhibition. So thank you. And as far as thinking about the exhibition and what visitors will take away, one thing that's very interesting to me is the idea that law enforcement is evolving and does evolve. And this kind of connects to the question earlier about the debates around law enforcement. I think those are crucial debates to be going on. And I think an important piece of that is thinking about the bigger picture historically and how we've gotten here and where maybe we can go from here. And, and how events like 9/11 have shaped what we know today as law enforcement. And, to see the process as part of a bigger continuum, I think is really important.
Absolutely. Michael?
Yeah, and again, like everybody else, thank you for having this conversation. I think it's an important one. It is a big topic. And, really, you could do a million exhibits on 9/11 from a million different perspectives. What's significant about this one, I feel, is that there has been a big impact on society because of 9/11 and wanting to be safe from having something like that happen again. There's still, as we all know, a million more things for us to be thinking about. And I think, as David pointed out, in a way, sometimes it takes an event like 9/11 for us to actually pay attention and actually think more deeply about some of these things, even though some of the indications are already there. I mean, the exhibition really is about this kind of web of responses that took place since then, and allows us to reflect on that and also on what it means to move forward from here as well. So I think it's an important experience for people, and yeah, I look forward to seeing it finished too, to have it done, and also to be able to get out with everybody and be together in a real life situation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. David?
Thomas, a lot of the focus of the national and global response to 9/11 has focused on the negative, and that's okay. That's human nature, and the deep problems with the Iraq War, the CIA interrogation program, Guantanamo, Afghanistan there for 20 years, leaving, Taliban still there, no defeat of Al Qaeda, no defeat of ISIS, no defeat of the Taliban. And domestically, yes, there have been some restrictions on civil liberties. Police did things that our criminal justice system, pushed over the edge in a variety of different circumstances. But I think the story people should really come away with, and I think what we do a good job with in the exhibit, is that if you woke up on September 12th and you were told over the next 20 years, there will be no attacks, motivated by this ideology, perpetrated by this group, that was not, even one order of magnitude less, 2 orders of magnitude less in terms of the numbers of deaths over 20 years. I think anybody, any lawmaker, any chief of police, any president would have said, I'll take that. And so it has been a success, and it's been all of government, all of society kind of approach, and involved military, involved foreign policy, involved international relations, involved international organizations, Congress, police, FBI, many different agencies, and so on. Again, some of the things we did were unnecessary and wrong. But 20 years later, we've kind of come to a kind of a consensus and a balance where the oversteps have been weeded out, and the things that we've done well, and they're highlighted in the exhibit: information sharing, greater partnerships across agencies and different kinds of fields, better intelligence gathering and analysis and use of it, improving our ability to respond to catastrophe. Of course, we need to learn more for pandemics, and we have and will. But those things have turned out to be effective, and people have been able to live, for the most part, free of fear. Yeah, some bad attacks occurred, and indeed we highlight one of them in the exhibit, the Boston Marathon. But those were few and far between, and usually perpetrated by 1 or 2 individuals, and very, very difficult to prevent. So by and large, I think this should be seen as not a celebration, but an acknowledgement of a pretty successful effort, of which law enforcement was important, not sole, but certainly an important part of. And I think that does honor to the people who sacrificed, that we memorialize, that was the beginning, and we've been able to build on that and actually, do quite well. encountering this horrible attack.
I agree, absolutely. And I'll close by echoing a key point that was made today, and it's that exhibitions and museums are essential to storytelling, and specifically for us at our institution for telling the story of American law enforcement. And we believe the more that we understand about the experience, the dedication, and sacrifice of officers around the nation and throughout history, the more we can contribute to their safety and improve the safety of those they serve here in our communities. So thank you all again for being with us. This was a wonderful conversation. And I'll turn it back over now to our CEO, Marcia Ferranto, for her closing thoughts.
Thank you to all our esteemed panelists, and thank you, Thomas, for moderating our conversation. Once again, I also want to thank each one of you for joining us today. Thank you once again to our sponsors. Our programs are made possible by our corporate partnerships and by individuals across the country like you. We need your support. Please go to lawenforcementmuseum.org, where you can make your donation right online, or you can text Programs 2021 to 41444. Both work, and it is super easy. Post 9/11, the evolution of American law enforcement opens to the public on Friday, August 27th, when our museum makes its grand reopening. It promises to be a big weekend with programs, giveaways, and many surprises. And law enforcement, this one's for you. We are excited to share that active and retired law enforcement will enjoy free admission from August 27th through September 30th, courtesy of our friends at FirstNet, built by AT&T. You can find more information on our reopening weekend plans at lawenforcementmuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to your visit and welcoming you back to the National Law Enforcement Museum.